India names first astronauts for upcoming human flights. Slim wakes up on the moon after a cold lunar night. And we get more updates on what happened to Odysseus on the moon. I'm Jack Beyer for NSF. It's Friday, the 1st of March, and there's a bunch more to come this week in Spaceflight. As you've probably noticed, I'm not Alicia. Due to a scheduling conflict, she couldn't be on this week, so instead, you're stuck with me. Last week, we had the amazing news that Intuitive Machines' Nova C lander named Odysseus successfully landed on the moon, and that the US was finally back on the lunar surface after 50 years. And then, we got updates a few hours after we published the episode. Par for the course. And a lot of you noted that we were missing information. Believe me, if any of us could predict the future, we probably wouldn't be covering spaceflight. So, as most of you probably already know, the lander unfortunately did end up on its side after landing. According to Intuitive Machines, its initial report that the lander was upright was based on a piece of data that had come through the communication system at the moment of touchdown, when the lander was still vertical and all sensors said that was the case. Except the lander did not remain upright after touchdown, and now we know this was not due to how tall or slender the lander was, or how wide the legs were. This was all down to the speed and trajectory of the spacecraft. During the preparations for lunar descent, teams discovered that the lander's own navigation system was not able to fire due to a switch that hadn't been turned on during ground operations prior to launch. This meant having to create and upload a software patch for the lander to use a NASA experimental laser navigation system that it was carrying as a payload. However, a software glitch meant that the lander's onboard computer stopped reading the data from this navigation system at an altitude of about 15 kilometers from the lunar surface. So what that means is that Odysseus flew all the way to the lunar surface nearly completely blind, relying only on its inertial measurements and its navigation camera, which is used for hazard identification. This system performed better than expected and brought Odysseus all the way down to the ground. But the ground ended up being about 100 meters higher than the computer thought it was. That meant that when the lander touched down, Odysseus was still going at about 1 meter per second horizontal speed and 2.5 meters per second downward speed. Images from the lander now show the incredible rough landing the spacecraft suffered as it landed, breaking 2 or more legs in the process. Odysseus came to rest shortly after on the side of the crater with a 12-degree slope and resting on one of its helium tanks, ending up at a 30-degree angle relative to horizontal. And I gotta say, given this rough landing, it's pretty incredible that it was still able to transmit signals and data back to Earth. According to NASA, 5 of the agency's 6 payloads on board have transmitted data successfully. Although teams will now have to look at how much data was recovered and what the quality of it is, the agency classes this mission as a success and is happy for the results, given that this was the very first landing of a lander built by Intuitive Machines. Sadly, one of the commercial payloads on board, EagleCam, was not able to be deployed during landing due to a software patch that enabled the use of the NASA navigation system. Teams then deployed it on the surface, but it appears either the cameras or EagleCam's Wi-Fi was not working, and imagery was not able to be returned, which is a bummer. But hopefully Embry-Riddle can build an EagleCam 2 to be flown on a future lander. A small telescope on board the lander, the International Lunar Observatory, or ILO, successfully captured images during the landing attempt, taking an impressive look at the cratered regions of the south pole of the moon. Another picture, taken already on the ground, shows the lens was damaged during the crash, and dust also got on the frame of the lens as well. However, through the glare of the sun and the darkness of the dust, one can see one of Odysseus's legs stranded on the surface of the moon. We could definitely talk about the IM-1 mission for a long time, and there's been a lot of additional info coming out over the last week that would just take too long to mention here. The lander is now in a dormant state after its batteries have been drained due to the sun moving out of reach of the solar panels. Alas, Odysseus was not designed to survive the cold lunar night, and so this might be the last we hear from it. However, Intuitive Machines says they're going to be listening in 3 weeks when the sun rises again and begins illuminating the lander's solar panels. So, you never know. Either way, good luck, Odie. Starting off the week, we had the launch of China's most powerful rocket, the Chang Zheng 5. Liftoff took place on February 23rd at 11:30 UTC from the Wenchang Space Launch Site. It was carrying the TJS-11 satellite for the Chinese military into a geosynchronous transfer orbit. This ended up being the 10th Chinese satellite to receive the TJS designation, and like all of the other ones, it's not clear what this might be for. However, this is the first one that's been launched on such a big rocket, so it would make sense if it has new capabilities or new technologies as compared to all the previous ones. Up next, we go from China all the way back to the United States for the launch of a Falcon 9. Liftoff took place on February 25th at 22:06 UTC from Slick 40 in Florida. The rocket was carrying 24 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. And yes, you heard right, 24 Starlink satellites, which is a first for Falcon 9. In fact, Elon said on Twitter that this broke the record for the heaviest payload launched on Falcon 9 at 17.5 tons. According to SpaceX's Vice President of Starlink Engineering, Michael Nichols, the company is aiming to fit another 4 more satellites by the end of the year, for a total of 28 satellites per mission. Needless to say, this is going to require either significant mass reductions on the Starlink satellites or performance improvements on Falcon 9, or a mix of both. As is normal for Falcon 9 missions, the booster for this one, B-1069, was flight proven, flying for its 13th time. The booster successfully landed back on the deck of drone ship A Shortfall of Gravitas. This year is a leap year, and that means having a leap day. There's only been one launch previously on a leap day, but this year we had 3 more. The first of these was a Soyuz 2.1B, lifting off at 5:43 UTC from Site 1S at the Vostochny Cosmodrome in Russia. The rocket was carrying the Meteor-M number 24 weather monitoring satellite and 18 ride shares into a sun-synchronous orbit. This is the 6th Meteor-M satellite launched, and the 2nd in just the last year, with another set to launch later in 2024. Along for the ride were 18 satellites, 16 of them being Citro AIS satellites from Sputniks. These are 3U CubeSats that carry receivers to monitor ships in the ocean via the Automatic Identification System, or AIS. There was another satellite, the Zorky 2M2, which is from the same company and carries a multispectral camera for Earth observation, as well as another receiver for AIS tracking. The last satellite is the Pars-1, which is an Iranian Earth observation satellite that is said to be used to monitor agricultural lands and forests. But it wouldn't be surprising if they use it to monitor other things as well. The second launch of the day involved a Shenzhou 3BE rocket lifting off at 13:03 UTC from Launch Complex 2 at the Zhishang Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying the, and I apologize for my probably horrible pronunciation, Weishin Hunliwan Gagawi 1 satellite into what appears to be a geosynchronous transfer orbit. Details about this satellite are scarce. The name of the spacecraft, literally meaning Satellite Internet High Orbit Satellite 1, implies that it may be an internet satellite, perhaps located in an inclined geosynchronous orbit. In this orbit, the satellite would be at the geostationary belt distance, but with a certain inclination relative to the equator. And of course, Falcon 9 had to make an appearance on Leap Day as well, with a launch at 15:30 UTC out of Florida. This mission was carrying another 23 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. This was SpaceX's first Leap Day launch, and as mentioned previously, only the 4th in the history of the world. With the 2 Starlink launches this week, SpaceX has launched a total of 5,919 Starlink satellites into orbit. Of these, 392 have re-entered, and 4,782 have moved into their operational orbit. As we like to do at the end of the month, let's take a moment and review launch stats for the year so far. As you can see, we've had a total of 41 launches, all successful, with the US at the lead and China coming in second with 10 launches. At this rate, we could see up to 250 launches worldwide by the end of 2024. Next up, India this week announced the class of astronauts that will be flying in the coming years. These new 4 astronauts are Indian Air Force pilots that have been undergoing a selection and training process over the last year or so. One or two of these people will form the crew of the country's first human spaceflight aboard the Gaganyaan spacecraft. The launch is currently set for next year, but will be preceded by many more tests. The first uncrewed mission of the Gaganyaan spacecraft is currently aimed for July of this year, with a second planned for the last quarter of 2024. A third uncrewed test flight will then take place sometime after, in early 2025, and that will set the stage for the aforementioned crew flight. During 2024, we may also see more uncrewed tests of the escape abort system that Gaganyaan will use, as well as further firings of the engines and systems to be used on the Launch Vehicle Mark III rocket that will put the spacecraft into orbit. More recently, on February 21st, the Indian Space Agency, ISRO, announced that it had completed all tests to human rate the cryogenic engine used on the rocket's upper stage. This engine, the CE-20, is one of the first Hydrolox engines developed entirely in India, and it's undergone a long series of tests to reach as high of a reliability as possible. Quite important when you're about to put humans in orbit. These new astronauts will also be eligible for another space mission, but this one will be flown from the US. Last year, India joined the United States Artemis Accords, and as a part of this partnership, India agreed to fly to the ISS via a NASA commercial crew vehicle. Since then, the country has bought a seat on the Axiom 4 mission, currently set for later this year, which means we may see one of these 4 astronauts going up on a Crew Dragon before the others go up on a Gaganyaan. It'll be quite interesting to see if India expands this partnership in the future, perhaps even with an agreement to dock its Gaganyaan spacecraft with the ISS. The country has big plans in the future, which would include building up its own space station and landing its own astronauts on the moon, so partnering with other countries is probably not out of the question. Next up, Starship. Although booster and ship testing tend to get the lion's share of attention, there are other parts of the program that are progressing as well. A whole lot of hardware and a whole lot of testing is going to be needed for the human landing system variant of Starship, and one of those key items is the docking system. The Artemis III lunar landing mission will feature an Orion spacecraft with 4 astronauts aboard docking to the Starship HLS lander, and it is this docking mechanism that was recently tested. This docking system is based on the existing crew and cargo dragging docking system, which was based on the International Docking Standard, which was derived from the ISS and shuttle docking mechanisms, which were derived from the APAS-89 that was developed to be used on the Mir station for Buran. In any case, this system was put through its paces over 10 days at the Johnson Space Center, with over 200 docking scenarios tested at varying angles and speeds to validate computer models. NASA says SpaceX has completed more than 30 milestones for HLS, with hardware tests for communications, power, life support, guidance and navigation, propulsion, and space environment protection. So we've said it before, but it really stands to reason that the work we see going on at Starbase Live, for example, is just the proverbial tip of the iceberg. On top of that really interesting news, this week we also had the FAA closing out the mishap investigation from Starship Flight 2. We have an in-depth video covering this on our channel, so do check it out if you want to know more. Preparations also continue for Starship's 3rd flight, with the return of Booster 10 to the orbital launch mount, and Ship 28 moving to that side of the launch site as well. We're expecting SpaceX to stack Ship 28 soon. It may even be stacked by the time you watch this, and try again to perform a wet dress rehearsal. I know all of this sounds like one of our Starbase update episodes, especially because I'm the one hosting Twist this week, but suffice to say, there'll be a lot to talk about in the next episode of Starbase Update, so keep your eyes open for when we publish that. Up next, Rocket Lab's line of orbital spacecraft has been marketed under the name Photon for a long while. That is, until now. The company announced this week that it has updated its spacecraft lineup naming. Photon is still in use, but this will now be the name for the modified Electron kick stage that can act as a satellite with its own propulsion, power, and communications. Rocket Lab has also announced a new satellite bus, named Lightning, that is designed to provide high power output, high radiation tolerance, and component redundancy for telecommunications and remote sensing missions. It can also last 12+ years in orbit, and is designed to be launched aboard Neutron and other medium-lift rockets. This satellite bus is based on the one the company is building for Globalstar and for the Space Development Agency and their own constellations. Pioneer is touted by Rocket Lab as a highly configurable platform meant to support unique mission profiles, including Vardaspace's recent mission to manufacture pharmaceuticals on orbit and return them to Earth. It can be launched on Electron, Neutron, or other vehicles. Explorer is Rocket Lab's solution for missions beyond Earth orbit. It is based on a satellite bus developed for NASA's Capstone lunar mission and is designed to support Mars and Venus missions, along with lunar and near-Earth asteroid flights, trips to Lagrange points, and missions to geosynchronous orbit or highly inclined Earth orbits. Explorer can launch aboard Electron, Neutron, or other vehicles. On this latest update, coming from the company's latest earnings call, Rocket Lab's CEO Peter Beck also emphasized his long-term goal, not just building and launching satellites for other operators, but also owning and operating these satellites themselves and providing services to people or companies on the ground. However, to realize a lot of these goals, the company needs to finish development of Neutron. During this earnings call, the company said progress continues with Neutron development, and they're still tracking a launch by the end of this year. This is a bit optimistic to say the least. The company has not yet fired up a single Archimedes engine, or finished the engine's test stand for that matter. The launch pad is still under construction, and first stage tanks have not been built, at least as of yet. It will be interesting to see at what point of this path to launch Rocket Lab will end up being at by the end of the year, but it really doesn't look like it'll be the end point. Regardless, here's to Neutron's success, and we're all hoping to see plenty of progress this year and plenty of Neutron flights going forward. Now, let's take a quick glimpse at some other stories across space. First up, Japan's moonlander SLIM is back! Teams were able to contact the spacecraft after it defied the extremely cold lunar night, something it was not designed to survive. SLIM landed on the moon on January 19th, but it did so upside down after one of the engines lost its nozzle during descent. This suboptimal orientation meant that SLIM had to be shut down to preserve energy, but it started up again more than a week later when the sun illuminated its solar panels. The spacecraft observed surrounding rocks with its stereoscopic camera for as long as it was awake, but on January 31st, as the sun approached sunset, it had to be shut down for the lunar night. But it seems that SLIM just doesn't want to give up. The spacecraft's solar panels are once again getting sunlight, and when teams tried to contact the lander, it responded. It even sent a photo it took with one of its navigation cameras. The contact didn't last long, as SLIM was still a bit too hot for comfort after being baked in the midday sun, but teams are preparing to resume operations once temperatures drop to more manageable levels. Next up, this week, Northrop Grumman announced that it had finished the first test segment for the Booster Obsolescence and Life Extension Program, also known as BOLI, for the SLS solid rocket boosters. These BOLI boosters have lighter carbon composite cases that will replace the current steel casings of SLS's boosters once they're all expended. In addition, there are other modifications which will add 11% more impulse than the existing SRBs. These boosters will start flying on Artemis 9 and will bring to life a new version of the SLS, the SLS Block 2. Before that, the SLS Block 1B, with an upgraded upper stage, will begin flying later this decade on the Artemis 4 mission. These BOLI boosters should add almost 5 metric tons of payload to the translunar injection, on top of the 42 tons that the SLS Block 1B can lift into the same trajectory. The test segment that was finished is the first of 5 segments that will make up the initial BOLI test article. A test firing is scheduled for late this year at the Northrop Grumman facility in Promontory, Utah, a facility that has been used since the beginning of the shuttle program way back in the 1970s. I love Utah, and I love Promontory, and I love seeing Northrop Grumman test these amazing pieces of hardware, so I sure can't wait to go back and witness this test. Next up this week, Firefly announced its new test and manufacturing facilities at Briggs, Texas. NSF's own Tyler Gray and Adam Suker were there as part of the media invited for the event, and we got to see the cool new stuff Firefly is building. Their new and shiny manufacturing facility is more than doubling the company's manufacturing space from 92,000 square feet to 207,000 square feet. This includes plenty of space to build and outfit the stages for the company's upcoming medium launch vehicle. During the tour, the company already had a test tank well into production with dome and barrel sections visible on it. The company's automated fiber placement machine was also in the process of building a new barrel section for this new rocket. Firefly has also expanded its testing facilities with new test bays for its Miranda and Vera engines, which will power the first and second stages respectively of the medium launch vehicle. The first stage for the medium launch vehicle will be the basis for Northrop Grumman's Antares 330 rocket, which is set to debut in the second half of next year. Firefly is also pushing through production of its already existing Alpha rocket. Teams are currently processing the next Alpha to be flown this May, launching NASA's ELNA 43 mission, and parts are in production for up to Flight 9 of this rocket. As part of this event, NSF also got to see the spacecraft manufacturing side of things at Firefly, including the Blue Ghost lunar lander, which should be launching in the fourth quarter of this year. Needless to say, this was a really cool update, and we can't wait to cover more missions from Firefly and anyone else that'll let us through their factory doors. Speaking of covering events, this week we also paid close attention to the ongoing testing of Blue Origin's New Glenn Pathfinder over at LC-36. As we mentioned last week, the rocket had rolled out to the pad for cryogenic testing to put the launch pad systems through their paces. Lo and behold, the other day we saw venting from the GSE, and then shortly after, condensation was clearly visible coming from the booster's LOX tank. This would be the one at the bottom, just like Starship. Max went to the best public vantage point possible to try and get a view of this as it happened. Look out for the ice falling off the booster in this clip. During this test, it didn't seem like the methane tank got much condensation, and perhaps it wasn't tested in this case. Since then, the rocket has gone horizontal, and we currently don't know what Blue Origin may be planning. A potential next step could be moving it into a vertical position again and testing the loading of liquid nitrogen, but this time on the booster's methane tank, or perhaps both tanks at the same time. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on New Glenn on Space Coast Live and with our regular flyovers. In fact, we flew this week, so keep your eyes open for our next flyover on this channel. And now let's see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. After a 48-hour delay due to weather in the abort zones, the launch of SpaceX's Crew 8 mission is now targeting liftoff on March 3rd at 4:16 UTC. After 15 hours catching up to the ISS, Crew Dragon Endeavour and its crew of 4 will be docking to the space station on the same day at 19:15 UTC. Right on the heels of the Crew 8 launch, SpaceX is preparing for another Falcon 9 mission, this time carrying Starlink satellites from Florida. The 4.5-hour window is set to open on March 4th at 19 minutes after midnight UTC. But wait, there's more. There's another Falcon 9 set to launch next week, this time from California. SpaceX will be flying the 10th mission as part of its small-sat rideshare program, Transporter 10, from Vandenberg. Liftoff is currently set to occur within an hour and 55-minute window that opens on March 4th at 21:04 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. Alicia will be back next week to recap this week in spaceflight. Until then, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.